Her daughter-in-law smirked. She won't even notice we left her. Ruth Ellison noticed. She noticed the unpaid repairs, the backyard fire pit, the secret Airbnb listing. 3 months later, the house was hers, bought quietly, under a shell company. Now they pay rent to a landlord they've never met. And when they break the lease again, they won't be warned, they'll be replaced. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The smell of cinnamon filled the narrow kitchen, cozy and faintly nostalgic, the kind that lingered in your clothes and memories alike. Ruth turned the tray slightly, inspecting the golden peaks. The tops had split just the right way. Her hands moved methodically, but her eyes flicked up at the clock. 9:42 a.m. Cameron usually rang the bell by 9:30 on Sundays, if they were stopping by. Melanie didn't like being off schedule. Ruth had overheard her say that once. Not to her face, of course. She set the muffins on the cooling rack and wiped her hands on the apron front. The front drape of the window offered a partial view of the street, just in case, and there they were. A white SUV rolled slowly past her driveway, clean and gleaming in the morning sun. Cameron drove. Melanie sat in the passenger seat, tilting her phone for a selfie. Ruth's breath caught when she spotted Sadie in the back seat, a streak of bright blue in her hair like a soft rebellion against the beige of her parents. Ruth lifted her hand, a small wave, hesitant but hopeful. Melanie glanced up and then looked away, her face smoothing over like glass. Cameron didn't see her at all. The SUV turned the corner, tires hushing against the pavement. Gone. Ruth's hand hovered mid-air, slowly lowering like a flag folded too soon. She didn't move for a long time, just stood in the kitchen with the smell of fresh muffins and the clink of nothingness. An hour later, while watering the begonias out front, her neighbor Margie shuffled by with her little corgi, tugging impatiently at the leash. "Oh, Ruth," Margie said with a sympathetic little smile, ran into Melanie at the cafe. They were dressed up so nice. I asked if you'd be joining and she just laughed, said she won't even notice we left her. Ruth blinked slowly as if the words were pollen in her eyes. Then, as if summoned from some long unused shelf inside her, she gave a thin smile. She's wrong. That night, after dinner, Ruth didn't turn on the TV. She didn't pour wine or call anyone. She went to the old cabinet in the hallway, the one no one else ever opened. She pulled out a manila folder, marked House 2119 Southridge, and laid it on the dining table. Then another, tax records, a stack of investment summaries, a printout from a property listing site she hadn't used in 5 years. Some of it was outdated, but not all. She placed her reading glasses on, snapped on the task light, and began to leaf through the quiet evidence of what she still had, what she still knew, what no one seemed to remember she was capable of. Outside, the neighborhood lights blinked off one by one, but Ruth stayed up, a pen in her hand, the smell of cinnamon still faint in the air. Somewhere down the street, Melanie was probably sipping wine. Cameron might be complaining about work again. Maybe they were laughing. She flipped to a blank notepad and wrote 2 words in small steady print, "Next steps," and then underlined them. It wasn't nosiness, it was navigation. That's what Ruth told herself as she crossed Maple Lane, cardigan buttoned up to her throat and a notepad folded discreetly in her coat pocket. Cameron's house stood 3 blocks over, nestled between 2 nearly identical rentals, all with the same beige siding, the same 2 green turf, the same mailbox that looked like it belonged to someone else. For years Ruth had passed it without really seeing it. Today she noticed everything. The white SUV was parked at an angle in the driveway, slightly crooked. Melanie's doing, she never parked straight. The garbage bin lid was half closed, empty takeout containers poking through like an afterthought. A faded wind chime hung by the porch light, tinkling weakly in the morning breeze. Ruth made no attempt to linger, but her eyes paused just long enough to catch the house number 189. She didn't smile this time. Back home, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, and a mug of plain tea cooling beside her. No milk, no sugar, just focus. She typed the address into the Spokane County Assessor's site. The owner was listed as Willow Bend Properties, LLC. No contact name, no local office, just a registered agent in Tacoma. She narrowed her eyes. That name didn't mean anything to her. Yet, a quick search showed Willow Bend had acquired nearly a dozen properties in Spokane in the last 8 years, all single-family homes, all mid-range rental, all insulated behind trust structures and P.O. boxes. Ruth leaned back slightly in her chair, hands steepled under her chin. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark laptop screen. Older, sure, but not out of... She reached for her phone and scrolled to an old number she hadn't used in almost a year. Jean Harper, real estate broker, former client, detail-oriented, loyal to the ones who kept their books clean. She hit call. Ruth Ellison. Jean's voice was warm, familiar, a bit surprised. Now there's a name I haven't seen on caller ID in a while. Still remember how to pull strings. I've still got 2 hands. What do you need? Ruth kept her tone light. There's a house I'm interested in. 189 Weller Court. Can you find out if it's for sale? There was a pause. She could hear his pen scratching. Let me poke around. Give me 2 days. I'll hold you to that. She hung up and let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The tea had gone cold. 2 evenings later, Ruth stood in the back of a local community center, her coat still damp from the drizzle. The art show was modest. Student canvases propped on easels, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, parents sipping cider out of paper cups. She spotted Sadie immediately, not by her voice, but by her brushwork. Her self-portrait was done entirely in ink and charcoal, angular and wide-eyed, with a hint of something pulled tight in the jaw. It looked like someone who paid attention. Ruth approached slowly, careful not to draw notice. She stood just far enough back that she wouldn't intrude, but close enough to see the name tag. Sadie Ellison, grade 12. Melanie stood nearby, speaking too loudly, laughing with another mom about gluten-free crusts and college applications. She glanced in Ruth's direction once, then turned her shoulder without missing a beat. Ruth didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out a small paper envelope with Sadie's name written in cursive, and quietly placed it on the display table beneath the portrait. Inside, a short note and a gift card to the local art supply store. No return address. No expectations, just recognition. As she left the center, the wind picked up, sharp with pine and rain. Ruth didn't pull her coat tighter. She let the cold wake. Ruth's phone buzzed just as she was folding laundry. Nothing dramatic, just dish towels and one of her better cardigans. She wiped her hands and reached for the phone without urgency. A message from Cameron. No text, just an image. She tapped it open. It was a group photo, sun-drenched and curated, the kind snapped by a waiter who's asked to take a few just in case. Cameron and Melanie sat near the center, leaning into each other. Sadie was half smiling, mid-blink. Melanie's parents were there too, faces slightly overexposed but perfectly present. Ruth wasn't even mentioned in the caption. No wish you were here, no sorry we missed you. Nothing. She stared at the photo a long time. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. It simply felt like reading the last line of a book that had quietly stopped being hers. By early evening, she heard tires crunch the gravel outside. She peered through the window as Cameron stepped out of the SUV, holding a white paper bag. He didn't ring the bell right away, just stood there, looking at the door like it might open itself. When Ruth finally answered, her expression was even. "Hey Mom," Cameron said. "We stopped by that new place on Riverside. Figured we'd bring you something. I know it's late." His voice trailed off like he wanted a pat on the back for remembering. Melanie didn't get out of the car. She stayed in the passenger seat, scrolling her phone, her foot tapping with impatience. "They had all that trendy stuff," Cameron added, holding out the bag. "Korean fusion, you wouldn't have liked it anyway." The words didn't sting. Not because they weren't meant to, but because they landed exactly where Ruth expected them to. She took the bag with a smile that said thank you and nothing more. He hesitated. "Okay. Well, enjoy." "Always do." she replied gently, then closed the door with the same grace she used to fold napkins at holiday dinners. She placed the bag on the kitchen counter, unwrapped the container, and stared at the wilted bibimbap and coagulated egg yolk. Cold, sloppy, the kind of food that still smelled like someone else's fun. She walked it directly to the trash can and dropped it in. Later that night she sat at her desk, the same one she'd used for tax seasons and retirement calculations. She pulled up her contact list and tapped a name she hadn't used in nearly a decade. Mira Voss, estate and trust attorney. The phone rang twice. Ruth Ellison, came the familiar clipped voice. Now this is a call I didn't expect, but fully welcome. I have a question, Ruth said calmly. If I purchase property through a shell, can my name remain completely out of sight? Mira didn't even hesitate. Of course. We've done that before. You'll want an irrevocable trust with a layered LLC. What's the property? Ruth paused. Not important yet. Just hypothetically, if the current tenants are family, can they remain unaware of the owner? Mira's voice dropped into something surgical. Absolutely. You want them to keep paying rent? Ruth's lips curved slightly. For now, there was a silence on the line, not heavy but pregnant. You sound like a woman building something, Mira said finally. I am, Ruth replied. I'm building distance. The morning began with a light drizzle that streaked the windows in narrow, quiet lines, like the sky was erasing something slowly. Ruth stood by the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the clasp of a modest pearl earring. She didn't wear jewelry often anymore, but today called for something grounded, something that reminded her of who she used to be, and still was, beneath the silence. She arrived at Jean Harper's office 10 minutes early. The building was tucked into a corner lot behind a dentist's clinic, unremarkable on the outside but steady within. Ruth appreciated that. She didn't need flair. She needed discretion. She needed things done well. Jean greeted her with the kind of nod that meant he'd already done most of the work. I took your numbers, he said, gesturing for her to sit across from his desk. Added a little padding. This offer should sing louder than the rest. All cash, no contingencies. She removed her coat carefully, folding it over her lap, before reaching for the pen he slid across the table. The documents were neatly arranged. Jean's office still smelled like lemon polish and old carpet glue, same as it had for the last 20 years. Without asking any further questions, Ruth leaned in and began to sign. Page after page, signature after signature. No one watching her would have seen even a flicker of doubt. The pen didn't pause. Her hand didn't shake. She turned each page like someone tracing a plan they'd memorized long ago. When they reached the final page, Jean cleared his throat lightly, though his voice remained respectful. You're absolutely sure about putting it through the shell? Some folks get cold feet when family's involved. Ruth looked up at him, her gaze steady. Family's why I'm doing it through the shell. He gave a quiet smile and slid the completed file into a legal envelope. Then escrow opens this afternoon. You'll be the invisible owner by month's end. Later that day, the second part of the plan moved into place with the same quiet precision. Ruth received an encrypted email from Mira's office, a draft of the irrevocable trust, carefully titled Marwick Family Holdings. There were no sentimental names, no nostalgic references. Mira had insisted the name sound neutral, distant, institutional, something that could belong to an East Coast trust fund, a legacy property firm, or an estate planner with 5 generations of lawyers behind them. That was exactly what Ruth wanted. She opened the file and read every word, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes skimmed through layers of clauses and protective language, like an accountant sifting for decimal points. She understood every line, every fallback clause, every disbursement term. This wasn't just paper. This was insulation. This was power without noise. Ruth's name was listed as the sole beneficiary. No one else would be able to trace it back to her without piercing multiple legal veils. And in the final section, under successor designation, sat a single line, contingent beneficiary, Sadie Ellison. Ruth didn't linger on it. She simply made sure it was spelled correctly, then printed the signature page and signed in blue ink. By sunset, the courier had already picked it up from her porch and Mira's office had confirmed, "We're live." That evening, Ruth joined her son's family for dinner. The invitation had come through Cameron again. No direct warmth, just enough obligation to keep up appearances. Ruth brought a loaf of crusty bread and a bottle of store-brand sparkling water. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Melanie had ordered in again, Indian this time, curry containers sweating through their plastic, non-folded limp in foil packets. The table was set, but barely. Cameron groaned mid-bite. "Still haven't heard back about the drain in the upstairs bathroom. Landlord's ignoring us again." Melanie didn't miss a beat. "Probably some bargain bin guy who bought the place in a foreclosure and thinks he's a tycoon." She laughed as she popped open a bottle of kombucha and rolled her eyes toward her in-laws. "I swear, we have the lowest class landlord on the block." The others chuckled. Ruth didn't. She chewed slowly. Swallowed. Set her fork down. She folded her napkin in her lap and said nothing. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. The contract was signed. The deed was transferring. The rent check they'd mail in 5 days would be routed through a P.O. box, then deposited directly into Marwick's private account. Ruth's account. They were dining under her roof. And they had no idea. The envelope arrived in the afternoon mail, heavy, cream-colored and marked confidential in raised black ink. Ruth carried it in from the porch with both hands, as if it were glass, her steps quiet across the tile. She set it down on the dining table without rushing, then made herself a cup of black tea before sitting. When she finally opened it, the papers inside were exactly what she expected. Finalized closing documents, stamped and certified. The home at 1189 Weller Court, once owned by a holding company called Willow Bend Properties, now officially belonged to Marwick Family Holdings, which meant it belonged to her. The title had been filed that morning with the Spokane County Clerk's office, carefully routed through Mira's legal labyrinth. The LLC was layered in a way that even the most obsessive snoop would have found dizzying. Ruth's name appeared nowhere, not on the deed, not on the filing, not in the state's public records database. To the world, the house was just another line item on a trust's balance sheet. To Ruth, it was something else entirely. The next day, she drove to the UPS store on 14th and Main and signed the lease on a private mailbox under the name of the trust. She paid 6 months in advance and requested that all rental correspondence be routed there going forward. Leases, notices, repair requests, and of course checks. Jean handled the rest. Rent collection would be automatic now. No more middlemen, no paper checks. The Ellisons would pay via direct deposit into an account they'd never be able to trace. Jean texted her later that day, with a brief update, "All systems live," quiet as a whisper. Ruth responded with a simple, "Perfect." Not because anyone was coming over. No one ever did. But because the act steadied her. The measurements, the warmth. The way the batter curled just slightly at the edges when stirred clockwise. She wore the same apron she always did, folded the same towel across her arm. The house filled with the same warm scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, softening the edges of her silence. At noon, she took a plate of the fresh muffins out to the porch and sat with a book she didn't intend to read. She waited, sipping from her mug and letting the sun creep across her knees. Sure enough, the white SUV pulled up at the corner. Melanie stepped out first, sunglasses already on, phone in hand, voice sharp as ever through the open car door. She was saying something to Cameron. Ruth couldn't hear what before flicking her ponytail over her shoulder and walking up the sidewalk toward their house. She spotted Ruth halfway down the block. Ruth smiled politely and offered a slow, deliberate wave. Melanie didn't return it. Instead, she whispered something over her shoulder to Cameron, smirked, and kept walking. As she passed her own mailbox, she muttered just loud enough for Ruth to hear, "She should be grateful we even wave." The words didn't land like a slap. Not anymore. They floated past Ruth like leaves carried by a breeze she no longer noticed. She sipped her tea, unmoved. If Melanie had turned around, she might have seen something flicker in Ruth's eyes. Not pain, not shame, but something colder. Something resolute. The kind of look that comes not from being broken, but from knowing exactly which piece to remove next. The message came in at 6:42 a.m., a Saturday, while Ruth was still wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The steam from her kettle hadn't yet curled over the windowsill, but her phone buzzed on the counter, lit up with a single notification from Jean's management portal. Tenant request, urgent, furnace not working. Unit cold, please dispatch repair ASAP. Ellison. Ruth sipped her tea first. Then, with the same quiet efficiency she had once used, balancing corporate ledgers, she logged into the owner dashboard, reviewed the request, and approved the emergency maintenance order. It would be handled by 10 a.m., according to the service agreement. She clicked once more, authorizing the $280 invoice with a note that read simply, "Proceed. Owner aware." There was no need for Jean to call, no need to let Mira know. This wasn't vengeance. This was routine. She had taken to these walks more frequently now, not so often that it would be noticed, but just enough to gather what she needed. The air had a brittle chill to it, not quite snow but not entirely autumn either. Leaves lay in crisp, crackling patches along the sidewalk. She paused, adjusting the scarf around her neck, and looked toward the corner of the house. A small patch of bubbling paint sat just under the eaves, barely visible unless you knew where to look. She lifted her phone and snapped a picture, tilting the lens as if she were simply photographing the sky. Then the porch light flicked on. Melanie opened a door just long enough to yell inside, her voice flat and annoyed. "Still freezing. I swear this landlord's slower than molasses." Ruth turned away before she could be noticed, walking a little faster but without guilt. The furnace had been fixed hours ago. They just hadn't noticed yet. She kept walking, past the row of matching mailboxes, past the maple tree that always dropped leaves unevenly, and toward the small community park where Sadie liked to sketch. Sure enough, there she was, legs folded on a bench, sketch pad in her lap, headphones over her ears. Ruth hesitated, then approached. Sadie looked up, smiled, and pulled one earbud out. "Twice in 1 week," she said softly, playful. "What's the occasion?" Ruth gave a small shrug. "Trying to get my steps in before the cold locks us indoors." Sadie tilted her head. "You've been walking a lot lately, have I?" "Yeah," Sadie said, narrowing her eyes. "Down our street. Around the alley. Last Tuesday you passed 3 times. Ruth exhaled a soft laugh, non-committal. "I guess I just like knowing what's mine," she said finally. "Even if it's only the sidewalks." Sadie looked at her for a long moment, then flipped her sketch pad shut and stood. Without a word she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Ruth's waist. Ruth wasn't expecting it, but she let herself be held. Her chin rested gently on Sadie's head as she whispered, "Just checking what's mine." That night, Ruth transferred the photo of the bubbling paint into a neatly organized folder on her hard drive. She titled the file Exterior, South Wall Sep 12, and backed it up to a secure cloud account Mira had set up just for her. It wasn't just about collecting proof, it was about remembering, observing, ensuring no one would one day claim she'd imagined everything. A leaky gutter, a crack in the foundation, a broken promise. They always started small. Ruth sat at her kitchen table long after the sky had drained itself of color. The late September dusk had given way to early evening chill, the kind that made floorboards sigh under footfalls and turned the corners of windows cold to the touch. The only light in the room came from the desk lamp, soft yellow, focused. Her laptop glowed faintly, the browser already logged into Mira's secure portal. The Marwick Holdings owner dashboard wasn't flashy, just folders, timestamps, documents neatly arranged and labeled with the precision of a tax audit. She clicked on the lease file, Ellison Tenant Agreement. It opened in a second tab. Ruth leaned closer. There it all was, the original signed lease, scanned and bookmarked, addendums, payment logs, utility affidavits, inspection photos, everything. She began reading with the same deliberate focus she once used to review corporate audits, except this time, the numbers were personal. Late rent, twice in the last 12 months, both paid within the grace period, but noted in the system. Trash ordinance violations. One warning, no fine, and then she saw it. A photo labeled Backyard Modification Septa and she clicked. The image was grainy but clear. A stone fire pit, unpermitted, freshly built in the center of the rental yard. Decorative pebbles surrounded it. Two Adirondack chairs flanked its sides like bookends. There was even a string of cafe lights dangling above, nailed directly into the property's fence post. The photo had been filed 3 days earlier by the property manager during a routine landscaping visit. Ruth exhaled through her nose, a breath caught somewhere between disappointment and satisfaction. She opened a new message window and began typing. To compliance at Marwick Holding Net. Subject violation. Unauthorized outdoor construction. Under 89, Weller Court. Body. Please issue formal notice of non-compliance to tenants regarding unapproved backyard modification, fire pit installation. Include reference to Lease Article 6, Section B. No structural or landscape modifications may be made without written consent of the landlord. Attach photo and timestamp. Proceed without escalation for now. Owner, Marwick Holdings. She hovered over the send button for 3 seconds, then clicked. As she approached the checkout lane, she spotted Cameron by the bottled water, scrolling through his phone with the distracted expression of someone trying to ignore life piling up. He glanced up and caught her eye. Hey Mom, she nodded. Cameron, he hesitated, rubbed the back of his neck. We got some weird notice today, something about the fire pit. Melanie's pissed. I thought that stuff only mattered in like HOA neighborhoods. Ruth raised an eyebrow, letting her pause speak first. Well, she said evenly, even renters have rules. Cameron shrugged, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. No one actually enforces that junk. Landlords just send those out to act tough. He didn't realize how close the truth brushed his fingertips. She picked up a carton of eggs and placed them in her basket, unhurried. Even tough rules are still rules, Cameron. Melanie says it's probably just some new manager trying to make a name for themselves. I'm sure Melanie has a theory for everything. He laughed again, but this time it was nervous, his voice trailing into the cereal aisle. Ruth didn't turn back. That evening, Mira called. Her voice was sharp as always, but tinged with curiosity. Saw your compliance notice went out. You want to serve them officially? Ruth stood by her window, watching the faint flicker of firelight in the distance. Melanie must have lit the fire pit again, despite the warning. No, she said quietly. Not yet. You sure? The violation's clear. You'd be in the right. I don't want to be right, Ruth said, her voice even. I want them to feel watched. Mira let the silence hang. Then, you're playing this long. Yes, Ruth replied. And I'm not even to the middle yet. The envelope she sealed that morning wasn't particularly thick, but it felt heavy in her hand. Ruth used her best stationery cream with a charcoal border and addressed it not to Cameron or Melanie, but to the tenants of 1199 Weller Court. Her return address, Marwick Family Holdings, P.O. Box 212. Inside was a cease and desist notice, drafted by Mira's office, formal and clinical in tone. The language cited ongoing non-compliance, unapproved commercial use of a residential property, and failure to seek written permission for third-party occupancy listings. Ruth had seen it days earlier, Melanie's Airbnb listing, thinly veiled under the name Cozy Spokane Cottage, Urban Retreat. The photos were unmistakable. Her fence, her soil, her property. Melanie had listed it without a single word to the actual owner. She wasn't going to scream, she was going to bill. The notice was delivered by certified mail on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Ruth was already walking past the house with a small paper bag tucked under her arm. Inside, a still warm loaf of sourdough, a gift for Sadie. She didn't expect to be invited in. She didn't need to be. From the sidewalk, she could hear the noise inside the house. Not music or television, but voices raised in disarray. Melanie's tone pierced through the front windows. I'm telling you, Cameron, this landlord is unhinged, who sends cease and desists over flower beds and fire pits. It's harassment. Cameron's voice followed, lower, less steady. I don't know, Mel. Maybe we should have told them about the listing. You mean the extra income that's been covering our utilities? Melanie snapped. If they think they can intimidate me, they're wrong. I'll fight it. Ruth adjusted her grip on the paper bag. As she stepped closer to the mailbox, the door opened. Not Cameron, not Melanie, it was Sadie. She stood in the entry, barefoot, hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. Her expression softened as soon as she saw Ruth. "Hi, Nana." "Hi, sweetheart," Ruth said, her voice warm but careful. She held out the bag. "Fresh from the oven. No walnuts." I remembered. Sadie took it, cradling it like something fragile. "Thank you," she said, then hesitated. "Why don't you ever come inside anymore?" Ruth smiled gently, though her eyes didn't. "I suppose," she said, "they built their own walls." Sadie looked down, clutching the bag tighter. Behind her, Melanie's voice rose again, this time angrier. "What do you mean the listing's gone?" "I had to delete it," Sadie whispered. She saw the notification just now. Airbnb froze the payout account when the legal notice showed up. Ruth gave a small nod. "Bread helps." Sadie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ruth touched her shoulder lightly. "I'll see you soon." And with that she turned and kept walking, slow, calm, without looking back. That night, Jean sent a message via the portal. "Rental renewal window approaching. Want to make adjustments?" Ruth didn't hesitate. "Yes. Increase monthly rent by $300. Include new terms requiring written notice for any subleasing or third-party use of property." Jean replied 10 minutes later. "Change submitted. Market supports it. Completely legal." Ruth closed her laptop and stared into the dark of her dining room. They had laughed at her, mocked her table, dismissed her as irrelevant. Now they would pay more to sit under her roof. And each month, with every automated withdrawal, Ruth would be reminded not of what she lost, but of what she reclaimed. The waiting room at Mira Voss's office smelled faintly of eucalyptus and coffee grounds, a blend that was strangely both soothing and clinical. The receptionist, a young woman with horn-rimmed glasses and a gold fountain pen, looked up as Cameron and Melanie walked in. "We have a meeting with the landlord," Melanie said crisply, not bothering to hide her irritation. "Mira something." "Yes," the receptionist replied smoothly. "You're expected. Conference room B. You can go right in." Cameron pushed the door open first, Melanie trailing behind him in a tailored blazer and shoes that clicked too loudly for the room's quiet tone. The conference table was long, walnut wood, polished to a soft shine. At the far end sat Mira, flipping through a slim folder, her reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. Melanie paused at the threshold. "We thought we'd be meeting a man." Mira didn't look up. "You're not." They sat, exchanging looks, their confusion laced with growing discomfort. "Is this about the rent increase?" Cameron asked. "Because it's way over market." Mira closed the folder in front of her with quiet finality and set it aside. "No, this is about ownership." Melanie blinked. "Ownership?" At that moment the door behind them opened. Ruth stepped in, not quickly, not dramatically, just fully present. She wore slate gray slacks, a soft burgundy sweater, and the same pearl earrings she had put on the day she signed the offer. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable. She walked to the seat opposite them, and without a word placed a leather-bound folder on the table. When she opened it, the first page, crisp, certified and embossed, read, "Deed of Title, 11189 Weller Court, owner Marwick Family Holdings, L." Cameron froze. Melanie's mouth parted slightly, her lips moving without sound before her voice caught up. This isn't legal." Mira finally leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "It's airtight," she said calmly. "Filed with the county. Verified. Your rent payments for the last 5 months have been deposited directly into Miss Ellison's holding account." Melanie turned to Cameron as if she expected him to say something, anything that would unravel this. Ruth looked at both of them and then, without raising her voice, spoke with razor clarity. "You said I wouldn't notice when you left me out. You assumed I'd fade like wallpaper or old carpet, but I noticed everything." Cameron swallowed hard. His hands were clasped but they were shaking. "Mom," he said finally, "you'd really evict your own son?" There was no pause, no dramatic breath. Ruth looked at him the way one looks at a stranger who's wearing someone else's face. "I'm not evicting my son," she said. "I'm addressing two adults who knowingly violated their lease, misused a home they do not own, and treated the landlord with contempt." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Melanie leaned back in her chair, arms crossed tightly, but her complexion had lost all its color. Her bravado had started to crack around the edges. Mira tapped the folder once, slowly. "You have until the end of the lease term to comply with all terms, including the rent increase and the cease on subleasing. Any further infractions, and Marwick Holdings reserves the right to pursue legal termination of tenancy." Melanie turned to Cameron again, her voice hoarse. "Do something." Cameron looked down at the table. His face was pale, jaw tight. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered. "She owns the house." No one said anything for a long moment. Ruth closed the folder gently, then rose to her feet. "I'll see myself out." Mira served the formal non-renewal notice 2 days after the meeting. It was delivered by courier in a manila envelope, stamped, time-logged, and signed for by a teenage neighbor who handed it to Melanie with a curious shrug. Inside, it was all outlined, with precision and no room for appeal. The lease would not be renewed. Vacate by end of term 60 days. No cause cited. No rebuttal permitted. Just business, as allowed under state law. Ruth didn't need to add a note. The notice had already said everything. Melanie tried to stir the pot. Group texts, clipped voice memos, not so subtle comments on Facebook. She called her cousin in Portland and cried about the betrayal, complained to her sister about elder narcissism, and even tried to loop in Cameron's uncle for support. But no one took the bait. Most gave generic responses. "Sorry you're dealing with that." A few offered quiet condolences, not for the situation, but for Melanie's tone. Cameron stayed quiet in the threads. Eventually, she stopped forwarding the messages altogether. The tension inside the rental became thick. As insulation, the furnace worked, the lights were on, but no one sat at the table anymore. Cameron had taken to sleeping on the couch. His office let him go when his performance slipped and deadlines slipped further. He blamed the economy. Ruth suspected it was simply the weight of not being who he thought he was. Melanie was always on the phone now, not talking, just scrolling, her thumbs a blur. Her voice had lost its snap. Her outrage had flattened into a kind of breathless waiting, as if she were expecting an alarm to sound and tell her it was all just a test. One afternoon, Ruth walked up to the house with a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. Sadie opened the door before she could knock. Ruth could tell she'd been waiting. Her eyes were puffy. She didn't try to smile. "I didn't think you'd come," Sadie said softly. "I said I would." Ruth handed her the parcel. Sadie opened it on the entry table, carefully peeling the tape. Inside were 3 of her art show pieces, each one framed, the glass polished, the corners secure. Ruth had taken them to a gallery framer, the best in town. Sadie stared at them for a long moment, before her voice cracked. "Why are you being nice?" Ruth didn't answer right away. Sadie blinked hard, holding back tears. "Please don't punish me for them, for what they didn't know about the listing or the—" "You don't have to explain," Ruth said, her voice gentle but certain. "But you were never the target." Sadie broke then, covering her mouth with her hands, trying not to cry too loudly. Ruth stepped forward and gathered her into her arms, the hug neither rushed nor rehearsed. It held. "Thank you," Sadie whispered into Ruth's shoulder. Ruth closed her eyes. "You don't owe me that. But I'm glad." Later that night, Ruth sat alone in her kitchen, drinking tea without sugar. The moonlight cut a long line across the table. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mira. "Courier confirms notice served. 60 days left." Clock started. Ruth typed back just 2 words. "Let it tick." The cafe was nearly empty when she arrived. Just a few laptop screens glowing behind ceramic mugs and the low hum of a playlist that blended into the wood grain. Ruth chose a table in the corner, far from the window, away from any breeze or interruption. She ordered chamomile, no honey, and waited. Cameron arrived 6 minutes late, wearing a jacket that no longer fit right and shoes that looked like they hadn't been shined in months. His face was thinner, not just from weight, but from something else, something carved out slowly by consequence. He spotted her, offered a tight smile, and walked over. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. She nodded once. "You ask?" There was a long pause before either of them spoke again. The server came, and Cameron ordered coffee, then changed it to tea, then back to coffee. When the server left, he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Things got out of hand," he said. "I didn't expect it to go this far." Ruth didn't respond. She let him find his footing. "I should have spoken up sooner," he continued. "But Melanie, she pushed for a lot of it. The listing, the remodels, the fire pit. She kept saying we needed to stay ahead of things, and I just went along with it." Still, Ruth stayed silent. "I thought maybe you'd never know," he admitted. "And when you did, when it all came out, I panicked. I wasn't raised to handle shame very well." Ruth tilted her head slightly. "You were raised to recognize it." He flinched at that, then gave a slow nod. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "But Sadie, she's already lost so much peace over this. She still wants to see you." "I know she does. She already does," Ruth replied. "We don't need permission for that anymore." Cameron looked down at his coffee, then back at her. "So what happens now?" Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Folded once, she laid it flat between them. "One option," she said. "Move out quietly. Leave the place in order. No legal disputes, no pressuring Sadie to choose sides. In exchange, I'll let her stay connected, maybe even stay close." He studied the page. It was clean, brief. A transition agreement drafted by Mira. Nothing more than logistics and next steps. Then he asked the question she had expected, but still found hollow. "What if I contest the trust?" She met his eyes. "Then you lose even more." He didn't ask what. Somewhere in him, he already knew. Cameron leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You always had the long game in you," he said, not bitterly, more like someone finally naming something they'd ignored. "I had to," she said. "You chose not to." Their drinks cooled untouched between them. Later that evening, Ruth forwarded the signed agreement to Mira. Mira confirmed receipt, then looped in Jean. Jean replied an hour later. "Understood. Beginning prep for re-rental or resale. We'll keep it quiet," Ruth replied. "Quiet is the point." The air was colder that morning than expected, a brittle kind of cold that clung to the siding and made every surface sound hollower. The clouds hung low, unmoving, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Ruth parked 3 houses down, not to hide. There was no more need for that. But because she wanted the distance, she walked the final stretch slowly, her hands deep in the pockets of her wool coat, the sidewalk littered with crisp leaves that didn't crunch, only whispered. From across the street, she could see the open garage. Cardboard boxes were stacked in uneven rows, some sealed, others spilling at the corners. A sagging mattress leaned against the doorframe. Melanie moved mechanically, her face drawn tight, her lips pressed in a line that had lost its power to cut. Cameron stood at the edge of the driveway, speaking with the movers. He wore an old college sweatshirt and looked smaller in it than Ruth remembered. He didn't glance her way. She kept walking, taking a slow, wide arc around the property, beginning with the back alley. She hadn't walked the full perimeter since she bought the place. Not like this. Today she counted every loose fence board, every uneven step, every gutter that sagged just slightly off-center. There was nothing vindictive in her gaze, only assessment, only ownership. She came around to the front, just as Sadie stepped out with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Her eyes landed on Ruth instantly, and she dropped the bag without thinking. "Nana." Ruth opened her arms. Sadie didn't hesitate. She crossed the lawn in a few quick strides and wrapped her arms around her grandmother, tighter than she ever had before. Ruth held her steady and warm, feeling the weight of that 17-year-old heart pressed against her own. "I'll write every week," Sadie whispered. "I promise." "You don't have to," Ruth said gently. "I want to." Ruth didn't reply. She just smoothed Sadie's hair down once, then kissed her temple. They separated reluctantly. Ruth turned her attention to the porch. Melanie stood at the top step, arms crossed, expression fixed in that same scowl she wore like foundation, the only part of her face that never cracked. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just clearly. She took one step forward. "I suppose," Ruth said, voice even, "now you'll know what being left out feels like." Melanie didn't respond. She didn't have to, because behind her the movers began lifting boxes, because Cameron didn't look up, because Sadie stood beside Ruth, not them. 30 minutes later, the truck's hydraulic lift groaned under the weight of the last load. Doors closed, engines started, and just like that, the house at 1199 Weller Court, once filled with noise, complaints, entitlement, stood quiet. Ruth walked up to the porch, reached beneath the mat, and retrieved the spare key she had placed there long ago. She held it for a moment, then pocketed it. She stepped inside. The studio above Ruth's garage had once been used for storing old Christmas boxes and long-forgotten lamps, but over the past 2 weeks, Jean had helped bring in a contractor, one Ruth trusted, to give the space a soft transformation, a new coat of pale green paint, refinished pine floors, better insulation for the winter ahead. The windows faced east, catching the morning light in a way that made the walls glow like calm breath. On a crisp October morning, Sadie moved in. She didn't come with much, just a rolling suitcase, 2 canvas totes full of sketchbooks, and a thrifted nightstand she'd refinished herself. But Ruth didn't see lack. She saw lightness, intention, the kind of beginning you step into, not run from. They walked up the stairs together, neither speaking much. Ruth unlocked the door, then handed Sadie the key, not just for entry, but for ownership of the moment. "It's yours," she said simply. "By lease, and by something quieter." Sadie took the key and tucked it into the front pocket of her hoodie. "I won't waste it. I know." They sat on the porch, papers between them, the backyard catching golden afternoon light. Mira read through the new designation aloud, more ceremonial than necessary. Contingent trustee, Sadie Ellison, to assume responsibility in the event of incapacitation or death of primary trustee, Ruth Ellison. Sadie, sitting 2 chairs away, looked stunned. "Wait, I thought you were just letting me live here." "I am," Ruth said. "And I'm letting you carry more than that." Mira slid the signature page across the small garden table. Ruth signed first. Then Mira handed the pen to Sadie. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote her name. For a long time afterward, no one spoke. A few days later, an envelope arrived in Ruth's mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was Cameron's, too neat, too practiced. She carried it inside, laid it on her kitchen table, and stared at it through 2 cups of tea. She didn't open it. That same evening, Mira forwarded an email from Melanie, subject: a formal apology, body: "I realize things could have been handled differently. If there's any chance of repairing this." Mira's reply was already drafted. Ruth read it with the kind of calm that came from certainty. All future communication regarding tenancy or estate matters must be directed to this office. Miss Ellison declines further personal dialogue at this time. Ruth didn't ask for edits. She let Mira hit send. On the last Sunday of the month, Ruth hosted a small birthday dinner in the backyard. It wasn't elaborate, just lemon bars, rosemary chicken, and a blue frosted cake from a local bakery with Sadie's name in looping cursive. There were only 3 chairs, Ruth, Sadie, and Mira, who brought a single sunflower in a mason jar and insisted she wasn't staying long. They lit string lights above the pergola. The wind was cool, but the warmth came from laughter. Unforced, gentle. After dinner, Ruth poured 3 glasses of sparkling lemonade and lifted hers slightly. "To noticing everything," she said. Sadie clinked her glass to Ruth's and smiled. "Even what isn't said." The new listing was tucked at the edge of a quiet block, where sidewalks sloped gently and the trees hadn't yet shed all their amber. The bungalow was modest. 1-story pale gray siding, a detached guest house in back, and a narrow greenhouse nestled behind a rusted wire fence. It didn't announce itself. It invited notice slowly, like a song that grew better in its second verse. Ruth stood at the curb beside Jean, arms crossed loosely, her eyes tracing the roofline. A small wind kicked a swirl of leaves across the drive. "It's undervalued," Jean said softly. "I know. No bidding war. Sellers just tired." "That's good. I'm not." Jean looked over at her. "You want to walk it again?" Ruth nodded. "Once more. Then we move." Inside, the home smelled faintly of cedar and faint dust. Untouched, but not neglected. The floors creaked kindly, not with warning but memory. Ruth moved slowly through each room, her fingertips brushing a windowsill here, the curve of a doorknob there. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. By the time they reached the back unit, the one with the greenhouse visible through old lace curtains, she had already made her decision. She turned to Jean, her voice steady. "Let's put in a quiet offer. No escalation clause. Just fair and fast." Jean smiled. "Mira already has the paperwork prepped." The deed was shielded under the same Marwick family holdings model, with layered protections Mira had refined from the first house. It wasn't secrecy Ruth was after. It was stability. Boundary without battle. She kept the main house for herself, but the back guest that she imagined might serve someone else soon enough. Ruth had helped her build a small site, and the orders came in slowly but steadily. They cleared space in the garage for a shipping area. Ruth found herself learning about backing boards and archival sleeves. Sadie, in return, made her a hand-drawn CEO of Tape Duties badge that hung on a ribbon by the laundry hook. Their days took on rhythm, not the old routine, but a new one that required no explanation, just presence. Then one afternoon, while sorting packages at the garage table, Ruth heard the click of shoes on pavement. Slow, uncertain. She glanced up across the street. Melanie and Cameron walked side by side, their pace aimless. Melanie carried a manila folder, probably rental application. Cameron looked down at his phone, his shoulders slightly hunched. They didn't see Ruth at first, but when they did, their steps faltered. Melanie's gaze darted toward the house, then away. Cameron didn't look up at all. They passed by the mailbox, the same one Ruth had once watched from her kitchen, wondering if they'd ever stop to wave again. Now they didn't. Ruth didn't move, didn't call out, didn't blink. Some moments don't ask to be answered. They just end. Just flagged an inquiry on the new property. Guess who? Ruth typed slowly, then replied, "Deny it, kindly." Then, after a pause, she added, "And raise the security deposit." The morning sun angled just right across the porch, casting dappled shadows through the slats of the pergola. Ruth sat in her usual spot, the one with the wicker cushions she restuffed last spring, and the small ceramic side table that always wobbled slightly on the uneven wood. A glass of iced tea glinted beside her, sweating gently. In her lap was a hard-bound copy of a memoir she'd been meaning to finish for months, but today she wasn't reading, just holding it, letting the words weigh down. In the yard, Sadie knelt in front of an easel, hair tied in a loose braid, fingertips smudged with green and ochre. She was working on a portrait of the greenhouse from the new property, not an exact replica, but an interpretation. The vines were more golden in her version. The panes caught more sky. A breeze passed, lifting one corner of Ruth's book. She reached to close it again, eyes drifting toward the curb, where delivery trucks used to idle, where Melanie had once pretended Ruth didn't exist. It was quiet now, not empty, just settled. The mailbox flag was down. The driveway was swept. The air, despite its chill, felt like it had loosened something. That afternoon, Mira emailed the monthly portfolio report. Subject: as of today, 2 assets, 0 liabilities. The PDF was crisp, simple bar graphs. No surprises. Rental income from the Weller guest house had been steady since the new tenants moved in. A young couple who paid on time, tended the hedges, and sent a thank you card when Ruth left a lemon pound cake on their doorstep. The second property, the new one, still sat vacant, but with purpose. Ruth wasn't rushing it. She believed space could hold value before it ever held people. She forwarded the file to a folder labeled Future. Ruth looked up from her spot on the porch, one eyebrow arched gently. The third? Sadie grinned. Come on, you're not done. That little bungalow's not the end of the trail. Ruth didn't answer immediately. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping once on the spine of her book. Then she smiled. That quiet corner of the mouth smile that held both memory and momentum. You'll decide that someday, she said. Sadie blinked. Me? I didn't build all this to end with me. There was no ceremony in her words, no grand speech, just fact passed like a thread between two needles. Around 5, a neighbor passed by with a golden retriever in tow. He slowed at the sidewalk, tipping his ball cap. Looks like you finally got peace, Ruth. She glanced up, hand cupped above her brow. Took a little while. Worth it, he said. She nodded. Always. As the sun lowered, the shadows grew longer, reaching toward the easel, the porch, the red maple near the corner that had started to shed in earnest. Ruth stood and stretched, setting the book aside. Her knees cracked, but she didn't mind. Inside, the kettle clicked off. Sadie laughed at something on her phone. The air smelled faintly of rosemary from the bush Ruth had trimmed last week. And for the first time in a very long while, Ruth didn't feel like a visitor in her own life. She felt like the author. She stepped down onto the grass, letting her hand trail along the porch rail, then turned once more to glance at the gate, the one Cameron and Melanie used to walk through without knocking. They hadn't tried again. They wouldn't. Ruth smiled once, not with triumph, but clarity. They left me out, so I bought the place they came home to, and gave them nowhere left to hide.